Hello, on Sitrep this week, we're explaining the art of military deception.
It's said that in wartime, truth is so precious that it needs to be protected by a bodyguard of lies.
80 years ago, the future of the world hinged on D-Day. And that depended on Britain and the US convincing Nazi Germany that, yes, they were planning to invade France, but that the liberation operation would start 150 miles away from the real target. Mike and I talked to Sitrep's Claire Sadler about the many layers of that deception, including fake cat badges, wooden planes, and King George VI.
It's actually something I think the Army today still look at as a model deception operation. I think that's because so many different layers of deception are all working and they all come together.
You couldn't do it in the same way now, with satellite scanning every square foot of the planet.
It's not surprising that we spent about 8 months watching the Russian forces form up around Ukraine. So you can't sneak up on anyone now with an army, navy and air force in the way that you might have tried to do, say, in the Cold War.
But General Sir Richard Barrons will give us some pointers to how new technology can also be used to our deceptive advantage. And we talked to one of the stars of a surprise West End musical hit, revealing the story of another key World War II deception through song and dance.
Sitrep with Kate Chabot and Professor Michael Clarke.
The whole D-Day operation was, it was the single biggest operation in military history, full stop, and far and away the biggest amphibious operation that had ever taken place. And it was always likely to be successful because of the massive amount of planning that had gone into it, or it would fail catastrophically. And the only two things that would make it fail catastrophically were the weather and the possibility that the Germans knew it was coming. And if those two things had gone together, if the weather had been bad and the Germans guessed or had found out where the invasion was actually taking place along the Normandy beaches, then the failure would have been catastrophic. The war would have taken a completely different turn, and the history of the last 60, 70 years, now 80 years, would have been very different.
And Mike, can you just give us an overview of what the premise was of this operation, Operation Fortitude? How did it come about and what was it exactly in a nutshell?
It was essentially to convince the Germans that the invasion would come in the Calais area, where the channel is its narrowest, rather than in the Normandy area, where the channel is at its widest. So instead of crossing 21 miles of channel, 22 miles, the invasion force was actually crossing 80 miles of channel, and they were landing on the Cherbourg or the Cotentin Peninsula, where Cherbourg was, instead of at Calais. Now, the Germans always knew that was a possibility, and even when the invasion was clear to them, they still thought it was a feint, because the real invasion, they believed, the real guts of the crossing was going to be made at Calais. And it was a simple question of deception. The deception operation was extremely complex, but it was this simple equation to make the Germans think that it would be Calais and not Normandy.
Claire, can you just give us an idea? It's multi-layered, wasn't it? And very intricate. Can you tell us a bit more about it?
It was very multi-layered, and actually I watched an awful lot of black and white footage of the troops landing on the beaches on D-Day as part of putting together the piece that I've been working on. I'm just thinking all those lives depended on this massive sort of deception campaign, and as Mike said, how it could have gone so wrong if it didn't all come together. And Mike's mentioned Operation Fortitude there. Operation Fortitude was actually split into two parts. There was Fortitude North and Fortitude South. And the North aimed to convince the Germans that the Allied invasion would come via Norway, whilst the South, as Mike was talking about coming from the Pas-de-Calais region, the most believable because it was perhaps the shortest distance from England. I went to the Imperial War Museum because they had an exhibition on there called Spies, Lies and Deception. And so I went to find out a little bit more because D-Day featured, because it was such a successful deception campaign. And that's where I met Amanda Mason, who's one of their curators.
There were sort of fake army groups set up and established. So, like they were even given their own badges, and communications were sent out to these sort of phantom armies. So that was one thing. So that gave the impression that troops were massing in areas that they weren't.
So the Phantom Army that she is talking about there was the First United States Army Group. And that was a fictitious Allied army group that was created to help convince the Germans that that main invasion force was going to come via Pas-de-Calais. And it was supposedly commanded by General George S. Patton. Now, he was one of the most respected American generals, which just added to that belief for the Germans that if anyone was going to lead this huge invasion, then it was probably going to be him. So I also spoke during my research that I was doing with the war historian, Dr. Helen Fry. She's also an author, written some great books about this. And she spoke about that tapestry, that's what she called it, of deceptions that all came together to convince the Germans to believe the story that wasn't true.
There were a whole number of deceptions which emerged, including creating inflatable tanks and having them near airfields or particular areas in the south of England, particularly in Kent. And again, if German reconnaissance aircraft flew over or they had a spy on the ground that we hadn't picked up, they would see this mass, and the tanks looked so real, particularly from the air. So the Germans bought that. They really believed that we were amassing our troops in Kent, ready for an invasion at the Pas-de-Calais, which is south of Dover. But apart from that, we also had an ongoing deception plan with double agents, both men and women. And this was part of what was called the double cross system. And many of us have heard of the feats of Garbo, double agent Garbo, ahead of D-Day. But all of this was so necessary so that the Germans would be looking in the wrong direction.
So as she said, the Germans really started to buy the story that was being put out there to them. But there were also, as well as that sort of big deception, there were also a number of smaller ones that were going on as well to help reinforce the story. For example, there was Operation Glimmer. That took place the night before D-Day. And that was aircraft that were dropping reflective metal strips that looked like tin foil, basically, to confuse the radars and to simulate invasion fleets going towards Pas-de-Calais. There was also Operation Titanic. It was one of my favorites. The dummy paratroopers that were known as Ruperts that were being dropped to draw German forces' attention away from actual landing zones. And when you go and see the Ruperts, there aren't many of them left. They're only 3 feet tall, but in the sky, they look really realistic. And they were dropped also with sounds as well, so that it simulated that they were sort of on the attack as they landed. But on top of these deceptions, they put a bit of a royal spin on it as well. They drafted in King George VI, and he made very highly publicised visits to various locations around England, including those associated with the First United States Army Group that I mentioned. And that was covered in the media. So again, it all adds layer upon layer of deception to convince the Germans.
And Mike, once they decided on the deception, how did they actually convince the Germans of the big picture deception exactly?
Or just by multiple different techniques. They just threw everything into it, as Claire said. So, newspaper items, the fact that Patton, because he was such a big name in Germany, the idea that he'd been allocated to this FUSAG, the First Army Group, seemed absolutely normal. And the idea that the Allies would not use Patton, that they'd sort of keep him as a decoy, really didn't occur to them because he was such a big name for an offensive operation. So they did it by so many different means. And the ingenuity of it, as Claire said, from dummies and the inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, lots of things on the ground that would be seen. And they also made sure that when German aircraft flew over, they pretended not to want them to see it, because if they just laid it all out, then the Germans might have suspected. So they went through the whole process of actually looking as if they were trying to chase them away, looking as if they had quite a lot to cover up in Kent and East Anglia. And so they thought about every aspect of deception. You can't find a single area of military activity that wasn't subject to this huge deception plan. And the thing, that I find most astonishing about it is that they kept the deception plan secret from the vast majority of people who were going to benefit from it. Just think of the number of people who would have been involved in this great conspiracy of deception, and yet it never leaked. How
many people actually knew about it, do you think?
I don't know, but I would estimate several thousand. It must have been at least a brigade's worth of people. I mean, 5,000, maybe 8,000 people. And a lot of people knew little bits, but they didn't know why it was involved. The actual plan itself, the idea that we're going to attack in Normandy, was a pretty closely guarded secret among a few hundred people at the very most. Because even those who were making the maps for it, they were making maps for the whole of the French coast. And they didn't know which parts of their maps might become more important. And they didn't know that until the day of the 6th of June, which maps had been brought out and put into the sealed orders. So I think you can probably count the number of people who actually knew exactly when and exactly where. You could count those in the dozens or the low hundreds at the very most.
And just briefly, Mike, I'm intrigued, but when King George VI was visiting those soldiers in that kind of, or one of those fake kind of visits he made, who was he seeing exactly? Who were those people?
Oh, they were people who were there anyway. I mean, there were soldiers in Dover because they had normal screening units. So they weren't short of units to be in Dover or on the southeast coast. And those units would eventually, of course, be going over in second and third wave. But they weren't the troops that had been the first wave. The Germans, if they'd had better human intelligence, if they'd have had spies who were active, who could have gone around Britain and looked at what wasn't there as opposed to what was said to be there, then the Germans might have got a better picture. But they never had good human intelligence. And all of the agents, of course, that the Germans thought were operating in Britain, almost all of them had been turned. Those who hadn't been turned had been shot. But almost all that they were getting back from Britain was actually controlled by British intelligence.
And Claire, D-Day was the biggest military deception in history to date at that time, but far from the first, because we have one that you've spoken about from Greek mythology, which is the Trojan horse.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great one, isn't it? If you go back and think about that, I mean, what a great plan that was. The Greek deception to end the Trojan War. They, I'm sure people know, built a large wooden horse, apparently hid soldiers inside it, and then pretended to retreat, apparently leaving the horse as a gift offering to Athena. Then the gates were open, it was taken in, and the troops, climb out. But yeah, I mean, these stories of deception take place throughout history.
And Mike, what others stand out to you?
Oh, and deception, one of my favourites is actually during the Second World War with Bill Slim in the 14th Army, when he was trying to take Mandalay from the Japanese First Army, very powerful. And the Japanese were trying to deceive him. They tried to lure him in, falling back quite quickly in front of Mandalay. And he was initially tempted, and then he realized it was a trap. And so he double-crossed them. He sent one corps as if they were falling into the trap to make noisy diversions, as if they were falling for it. He sent a second corps to the northwest to actually cross the Irrawaddy. And they took some heavy casualties crossing, but that forced the Japanese to put their reserves to it. And then while that was going on, he sent a third corps 70 miles south to cross the Irrawaddy unopposed. And he took Mandalay from the south. And the Japanese commander, General Hitari, he was completely bamboozled because he thought Slim was falling into his trap when Slim set a trap of his own. And he took Mandalay not from the north, where he was coming from, but from the south, with three separate maneuvers. One was a feint, one was a genuine crossing, one was an unopposed crossing, which became the main thrust. That was brilliant deception.
Absolutely. And Claire, you have one from World War I, the Battle of Beersheba.
Yeah, I mean, I was reading about this, and this is one I thought, oh, wow, this is, again, you can see these themes that come up time and time again, and it's very clever use of deception. But basically the Allies, this was in the Middle East, the British-led forces came up with this plan to capture Beersheba from the Ottoman Empire. And they'd already attacked Gaza a couple of times and had failed to make any progress there. So they then came up with a plan to draw attention away from Beersheba, which they decided to attack, by, again, pounding Gaza to draw in the opposing forces to there while they wanted to focus on Beersheba. And this plan included something that's called the Haversack ruse. And the Turks were allowed to capture this bag, which contained some false information indicating that Gaza was the main target. And to make the loss of that bag look realistic, they put in there, along with the false information, they put in their personal items like letters, apparently £20, which would have been a lot of money then. So it looked like this bag really had been lost, and they got hold of some critical information. They also set up fake camps, which we've seen it was done again during World War II. And ultimately, that was a success. They managed to confuse the situation, make the opposing side believe something different by planting false information.
When you talk about those kind of details and you read about them, it really brings home how much creativity goes into this kind of deception. What about Hitler's Germany? How much deception did they use?
Oh, a certain amount. I mean, at the tactical level, they were pretty good. For instance, in the invasion of 1940, the Battle of France in 1940, I mean, they drove through the sort of centre and then turned north. Everyone thought they'd go for the Channel, but then they turned north to cut off the British and split the British and the French. That seemed very unexpected, but they gave a good account of the fact that they were going to drive all the way through. And they were tactically very clever, and they were very clever against Russia. In 1941, when they invaded Russia. Again, it was mainly at the tactical level, but the Germans didn't have that grand deception that we see on D-Day, mainly because the biggest decisions were all taken by Hitler, who, he himself was the generalissimo. He was making the military decisions. And in fact, I mean, his decisions were pretty poor, strategically quite poor. And so the cleverness that you see in the Allied camp is only replicated down at the sort of operational tactical level in the German camp, because, Hitler was basically an amateur, and he wasn't even that gifted an amateur when it came to strategy. He just thought he was.
Now, if we come a bit closer to the present day, there was an important deception operation used in the first Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm in January 1991. Claire, can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, there was. And I hadn't really heard about this. It's a deception that isn't that well known, even amongst those who were involved in the war at the time. So much less well known than D-Day. And as you say, took place in Iraq in 1991. John Kirby was at the centre of it. He was the commander communications during Operation Granby. And he came up with a plan that would keep the location of British troops a secret and therefore allow them to take Saddam Hussein and his forces by surprise.
The problem was that everybody knew that wherever the Brits were was going to be the point of main effort. The whole of the divisional deception plan then was to make sure that the Iraqis did not know where the Brits were going to be. Now, there are two problems here. One is that all the American radios tuned to 0.5 megahertz. The British radios could tune to 0.25 megahertz. The only other radios in the Gulf that could do the 0.25 were sold to the Kuwaitis, and they were now in Saddam's possession. So I had to suggest that we should never be seen on our radios to be going to the west. And so when we exercised, when we went east, we radiated on full radio power. And then when we came back west again, we went on radio silence. And we set up the scenario that we were actually going to be deploying where we originally deployed in the east.
Did it take much convincing to get your plan past the generals?
The general was absolutely on board from the start. The challenge was that we would be limiting my ability to train the combat net radio of the division. And when the operation came to fruition, we had real challenges on combat net radio.
So what sort of problems were you encountering with that?
I remember the general saying, John, I need to change command further forward. I need to get into Kuwait. I said, look, I'm not in communication with the divisional headquarters that I have sent forward. They're meant to pop up and tell me that they're there. He said, I'll call the helicopters and we will fly forward and find them. And that's what we did.
Well, there's always a way around it somehow, isn't there, I guess. And when it came to that deception plan, were there signs that Saddam Hussein was believing the deception? Were you seeing any signs?
No, quite honestly. We didn't have enough intelligence of what was happening on the other side of the border. We were far more worried about something called HUMINT. In other words, should there be Iraqis wandering around as Arabs in that northern area of Saudi Arabia, well-informed, intelligent analysts, they could have spotted all sorts of things, like our deployment on the exercise was actually going west, even though there was no radios emanating from it. And I think we were very lucky. But you need a dose of luck when you go to war. So I can't say to you that Saddam Hussein did not know. And actually, before I deployed to the Gulf, I was told that Saddam Hussein had no equipment capable of identifying our single-channel radio access. It's like a mobile phone on Ptarmigan. And he used the 400 megahertz frequency. And I was told he had nothing that he could identify that. One of the first vehicles we captured in the Gulf was a brand new Land Rover, shipped out from UK by Rakel. And in it was equipment that could quite happily read the 400 meg frequency. And in fact, we took it straight into British Army use after we captured it, because it was far more modern than anything we had. So if that had been properly deployed and properly managed, then he would have had a very much better idea of what we were doing. That is all I can say.
How many people knew of the deception plan?
In the early stages, the general was not allowed to tell anybody before New Year's Eve, okay? Then it was only a group of lieutenant colonels, the commander of the engineer regiment and a couple of his commanding officers. It was at commanding officer level at that point. I only revealed it to my soldiers when we went on the exercise called Dib Dibber Charge, because I had to explain to them why we were not radiating as we went west. So that's where it came out. But lots of people didn't realize, they wouldn't have recognized it as a deception plan. And indeed, one of my officers, when asked about the deception plan, said there wasn't one. I was able to say, I'm terribly sorry, you were busy running your part of the regiment. I was deeply involved in managing the deception plan. I'm still in touch on Facebook with a lot of the soldiers I took on that operation. It's 33 years ago now, and I'm immensely proud of what was achieved.
That was a real treat to speak to John.
And it's interesting there because I was reading quite recently Simon Mail's book, Soldier in the Sand, and he was a senior staff officer. He said they spent a lot of time worrying that the Iraqis had discovered the plan. He said there was no indication that they had, but they constantly looked for indications were the Iraqis doing anything which indicated they might know of the real plan, and they didn't, and they didn't know, and the left hook was incredibly successful in the event. I mean, it was a 100-hour war. 3.5 days, they had expelled the Iraqis from the whole of Kuwait.
Yeah, it really was an achievement, remarkable. Claire, when you were looking at deceptions, there are smaller scale ones from the 21st century in Iraq and Afghanistan, aren't there?
Yeah, I mean, there were some really small scale ones, for example, where you're just trying to trick the enemy that perhaps you have more intelligence than you're letting on. So in some of the forward operating bases in Afghanistan, I saw fake cameras, like CCTV cameras that had been set up. When you look at them, perhaps close up, you could see that there's not a lot going on there. But actually, from a distance, that's a good way to deceive the enemy, to think that actually you know a bit more than perhaps you're letting on. So, yeah, they don't have to be these huge, big scale deceptions. Often it can be the small things that add up to deceiving the enemy.
Well, from Troy in 1184 BC to Helmand in the 2010s, much has changed. Our armed forces now live and work in a transparent battle space with almost nowhere to hide from all sorts of technologies. So can militaries still effectively deceive their enemies? And if so, how? General Sir Richard Barrons is the former head of Joint Forces Command.
The space capability is moving to the point where you can follow a moving car, almost in all weathers, but also from the ubiquity of data, open source data. We all carry things that connect us to the internet. And in that setting, it's not surprising that we spent about 8 months in the West watching the Russian forces form up around Ukraine. And by 3 months before the invasion actually occurred, it was certain that they were going to invade. And that was from a range of human and other data sources. So you can't sneak up on anyone now with an army, navy, and air force in the way that you might have tried to do, say, in the Cold War.
And what kind of opportunities does modern technology create for a different kind of deception?
Well, the first thing is to recognize the scale of the challenge, which is we operate in this transparent world. And as precision weapons get more accurate and at longer and longer ranges, not only can people see you almost anywhere, they can hit you almost anywhere. So in the physical world, we're going to have to find different ways of hiding military capability. Now, that might be by making more use of complex urban environments and not pretending you can hide an army in a wood, for example. But also we should recognize a lot of this is in the digital space, and that with the advent particularly of AI-propelled social media, there's a whole range of things you can do to create audio and visual product that is designed to throw your opponent off the scent by giving them very convincing pictures and sounds of what you're actually not doing.
How far can cyber, for example, go in seeding fake intelligence?
One aspect of offensive cyber activity is to put data in your enemy's data stores and networks that is designed to mislead him. But before you do that, the first contribution cyber is going to make to deception is to make sure your own accurate information is not accessed, and maybe allow fake information to be accessed by an opponent that is trying to get into your information systems. And then there is this vast arena that's established by the fact that nearly every adult is connected to the internet, generally through their smartphone, through the manipulation of principally social media, but more broadly than that, the internet generally. You can create a sense in your opponent's minds of what's happening or how they should feel about something that is entirely fake. And now that we have artificial intelligence becoming so prevalent, we're in a place where we can produce tailored messages to literally millions of individuals at the same time in a way no human could ever do. So the scope for deception in the digital arena is the most significant change, and none of that need have any relationship at all with the truth or facts on the ground. It is simple manipulation.
And what about electronic warfare capabilities? Can they create a fake battlefield picture, for example?
So if you go back to the example of D-Day and the creation of the first US Army group, an entirely fictitious army, a really big important part of that was how they located radio transmitters in all the sorts of places you might expect to find a divisional headquarters or a brigade headquarters. And they 24/7 ran chatter on those networks, sometimes secure and sometimes deliberately not secure to mislead. And it was really, really effective. But the point about the things you can do in the electromagnetic spectrum is that they are profoundly important, but they come to naught unless they are linked to seamlessly physical things. So in the first US Army group, not only were there fake radio messages, there were lines of fake tanks, rubber tanks, literally, and rubber and canvas landing craft in order to connect a physical presence with a digital presence. And it will be no different in the future. It's just that the technology is much more advanced now.
And we've heard on Sitrep, for example, about inflatable rocket launchers being used as a target on exercise. Could those also still be used as a convincing decoy?
Yes, all of that will still apply. They'll have to be better because the sensors that look for things like rocket launchers are much more sophisticated. So they've got to have the same radar signature. They've actually got to look the same through a camera. They've got to have the same electronic signature. Now, all of that is possible, but you can't just paint some canvas and stick it in a field anymore. It's got to be multi-spectrally effective.
And what's your favourite deception story from history?
Oh, by a country mile, it's Operation Mincemeat. The effort that was put into creating a false identity around a dead body, essentially, of a vagrant, and floating this body with a complete set, not only of fake war plans, but also a life history, and they fell for it. And it was an astonishing act of decisive strategic deception of the highest level of skill.
And did you see the film?
I've seen the film and I've seen the musical, and the musical is fabulous and very funny.
And are there any deception operations from your time in uniform that you were involved in that you would be able to tell us about?
So deception has played a relatively small part in the interventions in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, save that it was necessary to deceive about small things like the locations of convoys in order to avoid improvised explosive devices. The much more interesting use of deception in the post-Cold War era has been, I think, in the arena of counterterrorism, where very skilled operators have managed to interfere with the communications, public and private, and the data storage of terrorist organizations in order to mislead them and their followers. That's very skilled work done by a few very talented specialists. And we need to recognize that now we again live in an era of great power confrontation. We're back to more like the sort of deception that would have been a natural part of operations in the Cold War or the Second World War.
General Sir Richard Barrons, it's good to speak to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Mike, on Sitrep, we talked a lot in the spring of 2021 of that Russian troop buildup around Ukraine. With the benefit of hindsight now, do you see that as deception? Was it a feint? How do you see it?
Well, we're honestly not sure, Kate, whether it was deception or it was Russian ability to just sort of push the envelope and then stand down while they thought about what to do next. But it certainly fits the pattern of going through a process of build-up and then taking it down again. I'm not sure it was deception so much as it were consideration of what might work. But certainly, when the build-up in late 2021 began, the Allies said, look, they did this last year and they stood it down. They made some threatening noises. They'll probably do the same again. Usually, you've got to do things a bit more frequently to get the sense of it, because it has happened before. I mean, the Egyptians in the Yom Kippur War of 1973, they kept on practicing for an attack across the canal and then standing down, practice standing down, practice standing down. And the Israelis, when they saw the practice ramp up again in October 1973, said, oh, they're just practicing. And of course, they weren't. And that's exactly what Hamas did before the 7th of October attacks. They went through a series of drills and stood them down. And Israeli intelligence got used to the drills and so didn't think that the latest drill just before October the 7th meant anything. That's a very old technique to actually keep on drilling and standing down. And then one day you drill and you go through with it. So it's not rocket science, but it does work if you can lull the other side into a false sense of security.
And if we did need to do another D-Day, could we do it?
Oh, gosh. If we needed a big deception, a big grand strategic deception, it's hard to imagine Britain being involved in itself alone in a grand strategic enterprise. And if we did it, it'd be part of an Allied enterprise, a NATO enterprise. Gosh, I struggle to believe we could do anything as sophisticated as that, because remember, the D-Day deception came after 4 years of total war. And that it's very hard for us to put ourselves in the shoes of people who had lived through that. And people who worked on it, we were speaking earlier in the program about the relatively small number of people who knew the actual details of it. And some of those people, even who worked on the components, they didn't tell their husbands and wives until years later. Yeah. And there are many cases of both the husband and the wife working on secret stuff. And they didn't even exchange their secrets until they'd been married for 30 odd years. I mean, most of us, have secrets from our spouses that we hold on to for 30 years, but not normally national security secrets.
Oh, Mike, speak for yourself, eh? Now, Richard Barrons mentioned Operation Mincemeat and the fact it's been turned into a very surprising musical. Claire, before we hear about that show, just explain the deception, will you? It's another version of the haversack ploy that you mentioned earlier.
There are some similarities, aren't there? And like Richard Barrons, I think Operation Mincemeat is just amazing. It actually came before D-Day, of course, took place in April 1943, and there's some question about whether the success of Operation Mincemeat gave us the courage to go ahead with those deception D-Days, because we've done it once, could we do it again? So the aim was to convince the Germans that the Allies' plans for southern Europe were to invade Greece and Sardinia instead of Sicily. And it was brilliant. That body that was dressed in a Royal Marine uniform, it was launched from a submarine into the sea off the coast of Spain, carrying those supposedly secret documents. And to make the deception even better, as Richard Barrons said, great detail went into the planning of that. So this person was given a real personality. Their documents on, show what their name was. I think he was called William Martin, a photograph of his fiancée, even came to like a theatre stub in his pockets as well, an engagement ring, I think. So all sorts of things to make it look more realistic that this body was actually, you know, a real body that had been found floating with these secrets. And that information was passed on to the German intelligence officers, and it was acted upon. And that, of course, then meant that the resources were diverted away to Greece and Sardinia, weakening those defences in Sicily. So hugely successful.
Well, maybe that's why Operation Mincemeat has been turned not into just a film, but also a hit West End musical in the last couple of years. Don't expect a classic piece of war drama. The producers describe this as Noel Coward meets Noel Fielding. Christian Andrews currently plays the head of the MI5 Secretarial Division, Hester Leggett, among many other roles. Christian, great to have you on Sitrep. Thank you for your time. So how many roles do you play?
I think the current count is something like 30. Our fans are very particular and will boil the show down to all the information they can. They're a very intelligent bunch. I think the track I play is about 30 characters, and it's very similar for the other 4 people in the show as well. So between the 5 of us, lots and lots of madcap people.
I love the way you say, I think it's about 30.
It's under discussion as well, because there are different waiters that we play as well in certain scenes, and some people are saying, well, are they the same person? Are you at the same restaurant? So it's open to interpretation sometimes.
And that's all that we need to know about deception, isn't it? What is it about the story? What is it about the story that appeals to you and the audience exactly?
I think the way that this story is told, because there's only 5 people in the show, it very much aligns with the idea of a small group of people doing something mad. Mm-hmm. So the same as Charles Cholmondeley and Ewan Montague in 1943, a small group of people making something huge happen is similar to having 5 actors on stage playing upwards of 100 characters and starting at 7:30, and by the time we get to 10 o'clock, we've created this humongous thing with hats and and the way we turn around and blackboards turning around. It has the same kind of vibe as faking documents and using what you have to make something interesting happen.
And yet the story itself is serious and it's dark. Does it feel odd doing it as a comedy song and dance show?
I think it sometimes does. Sometimes you do zoom out and you sort of think, oh, this is very real, and this is very, it can be heart-wrenching, as is any story where war and people are involved. But I think the thing about this show is that the writers have done really well to include that pathos. Like, a lot of the time in the show is used to pay tribute to people like Linda or Michael, like the song where we write the letter.
She hopes you'll be home again soon. No. She knows you'll be home again soon.
I think that's about 6 minutes worth of the show where the madcap stops, the running around, the jumping up and down, and we're still for a second, where the audience can really sort of reflect on what it is they're actually watching, what it is they're laughing at. And I think the more we make them laugh, the more we can make them think as well, which is a great tool.
And it did already have some stardust, a very real link to James Bond, didn't it?
Oh, completely. So I believe the actual Operation Mincemeat plan was an idea thought up by Ian Fleming, taken on by somebody else, and turned into Operation Mincemeat. So there are some fun Bond moments in the show. We pay tribute to Ian Fleming quite a bit.
And one of the things that stands out about the show is how, by the end, the central character is the homeless man whose body was used for this deception.
Completely. And I think that, as I was saying earlier, the more we can make them laugh, I think the more we can make them fall in love with the characters, and in turn be very interested into who Glyndor Michael was as a person, because I think we sort of, in a way, we sort of fool the audience into thinking in a similar way to how Montague is thinking in our version of the story, that we're just sort of using this body, whereas actually the seriousness of that, I think it pays a great deal of respect to him, which I really enjoy playing each night. It feels sort of right and nice at the end of the show, after all of that, to say to the sort of 400 people in front of you, actually, you know, this was very real for one person, and that one person was Glyndor Michael, and that's who he was.
Did you look into his past much?
I did. He's actually from Aberbargoed originally, before going to Cardiff, which is, I'm not sure if it still is now, but certainly at the time was in the county of Monmouthshire, which is actually where I'm from. The Welsh connection to that is really personal for me. So yeah, I feel quite honoured to tell his story.
And you mentioned earlier how the audience are kind of counting up all the different roles, characters, and arguing over how many there were and updating, et cetera, et cetera. And it's the fact that they've really got into this, the story, the musical. They've turned detective, revealed new details about Hester Leggett and what she did. Tell us all about that.
So the show is based on Ewan Montague's telling of Operation Mincemeat. And in the book, he misspelt Hester's name. So through a misspelling, it meant that her history had almost been completely erased, whereas our fans didn't feel that was good enough and went directly to MI5. I think because they fell in love with the character as well.
They went to MI5. Really?
They went to MI5 and they said, we think that this person, Hester Leggett, worked for you. Please, can you tell us if this is the correct Hester Leggett from our story? And I think because it had been a certain amount of years, MI5 were able to confirm that, yes, your Hester Leggett is our Hester Leggett, but her name was actually spelt with an A and not an E. So,
just to be precise.
Exactly. But through that, they managed to find things like her diaries. They found out that she passed her piano lessons as a child. And it's information like that is so lovely when you're telling a true story. Just to know that Hester passed her piano lessons, it gives you just this wealth of like characterization of like who she was. And it means as well that some of her surviving family have been able to come and see the show as well. So to have that personal connection to a story that we're telling that is true is mad and very, very exciting.
It sounds like you're having a great time. I hope you enjoy the rest of the run. It's been really great speaking to you, Christian. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kate.
And Operation Mincemeat is at the Fortune Theatre, currently due to run until January, but who knows? Its run has been extended how many times already, Christian? Several, anyway.
I think we've just announced our 9th extension. Yeah.
Long may it last. Thank you so much.
Well,
good luck with it all.
Thank you.
And you know what? I'm really glad to know that Hester passed her piano. She did better than I did, Mike. Mike, Claire, have either of you two seen the show? Because, I mean, I haven't, but I really want to now.
No, I haven't seen it yet. I intend to.
I haven't either.
Yeah, Mike, you know, drawing on your kind of amateur dramatics past, or was it semi-professional? I could see you in that role. I could see you on that stage.
A long time ago, Kate. Many years ago. Previous life.
Yeah. Just as a sort of final thought, what goes through your mind on the 80th anniversary?
Well, my grandfather landed on Gold Beach on D-Day, so it's very personal for me. I definitely will be thinking about him, but also all those others that landed on the beach. But I think having that personal connection really I always feel very emotional come the day, just imagining, what everyone went through.
And Mike?
Again, I'll be thinking about my father. He didn't go in on the day. He was the next wave the following day. And he went in on Sword Beach, and he went in standing up in a vehicle with a Bren gun as they were scanning the skies. And the vehicle that went in front of him went straight underneath and drowned everyone. And then they went over the top of it because the landing craft had pulled back, and a Bren gun carrier everyone was drowned inside it, and his vehicle was the next one to go off. And he said he was pretty grateful and very sobered when his vehicle reached the beach and drove up the sand.
Well, you've both given us lots to think about today. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Claire. And you can find Claire's film telling the full story of the D-Day deception and much more about the 80th anniversary on the Forces News YouTube channel. Professor Michael Clarke and I will be back with another Sitrep next Thursday. For now, though, from me, Kate Chabot, thank you for listening. Bye-bye.